They were declared dead in 1978, but 45 years later, the truth walked back into town. They were the picture of an all-American family, faithful, well-liked, involved in their community. They boarded a plane on a bright summer morning and never came back. No distress call, no wreckage, no bodies, just silence. But years later, when a hunter stumbled upon their plane buried deep in the Everglades, the truth began to rise. Slow, dirty, and far more terrifying than anyone imagined. This is not just a mystery. It's a reckoning. The morning of July 17th, 1978, broke clean and golden over Cypress Bend, a sleepy Florida town nestled in the arms of cypress trees and Spanish moss. The sun had barely stretched across the rooftops when Richard Dunmore rolled the green duffel bag into the back of his old station wagon. He was a man built from square lines, 42, calloused hands, and a jaw that always seemed to clench just a little too tightly, even when he smiled. His wife, Elaine, followed close behind with a red cooler tucked under one arm, her other hand shielding her eyes as she looked up at the soft morning sky. Her face, still lovely at 39, carried the kind of quiet weariness no amount of sleep could fix. Their daughter, Melanie, stood at the edge of the driveway, the strap of her clarinet case digging into her shoulder, her mouth set in a line too serious for a 14-year-old. She didn't speak much that morning, not even to her younger brother Noah, who darted around the yard pretending to pitch an invisible baseball. He was 10, small for his age, all elbows and scraped knees, and in that moment he was blissfully unaware that anything about this day was unusual. The Dunmores were not flashy people. Richard owned the hardware store on Main. Elaine volunteered at the local elementary school. They went to church on Sundays, kept their lawn trimmed, and waved to every neighbor whether they liked them or not. From the outside, they were solid. Good stock, as the older folks in town would say. But that morning, even the birds seemed to hush as the family loaded up the car. The drive to Cypress Air Charter took less than 10 minutes, down roads still wet from the night's dew. Wade Collins, their pilot, was already prepping the Cessna 210 by the time they arrived. He was tall, with silver at his temples, and a voice like gravel. Ex-military, some said, but he never talked much about it. Wade gave a short nod when he saw them. "We're ready to go," he said, too quickly. Elaine looked at Richard for a beat longer than necessary before offering Wade a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The family climbed aboard, Melanie hesitating just long enough to glance back at the car. Lacey, her best friend, had wanted to come say goodbye, but Melanie had told her not to bother. "It's just a sightseeing trip," she had said. "We'll be back for dinner." But even then, something in her voice had cracked at the edge. A few early risers in town saw the Cessna rise into the blue like a silver arrow. No clouds, no wind. It was as perfect a morning for flying as any. At 7:42 a.m., the plane disappeared over the tree line, heading southwest toward Everglades City. By noon, it still hadn't arrived. At first, no one panicked. Air traffic sometimes got rerouted. Radios cut out. But when the tower confirmed that radar contact had been lost just 10 miles out, the anxiety settled in fast and thick like the summer heat. Richard's employee at the hardware store called the sheriff. Elaine's friend from the PTA called the school. By 2 p.m., search efforts had begun. Helicopters scoured the skies. Boats crept through black water, thick with reeds and mosquitoes. Volunteers combed the swamps on foot, slapping away horseflies and ignoring the warning signs about alligators. For 2 weeks, Cypress Bend pulled together like the pages of a closed book, refusing to believe the ending had already been written. But no oil slicks surfaced, no seats, no scrap of fuselage, no single clue that a family of 4 and their pilot had ever taken off at all. When the official search was called off, it was like a funeral without a casket. Neighbors delivered casseroles to the Dunmore house for weeks, though no one ever answered the door. Melanie's best friend Lacey clipped every newspaper article, every rumor, and taped them to her bedroom wall. She swore she could feel Melanie's absence in the silence between words. Noah's baseball team retired his number, painting it on the dugout wall in fading white. Elaine's parents, too broken to stay, packed up and moved out of state. The Dunmore home, once cheerful with hanging plants and wind chimes, turned into a shell. Shutters closed, mail overflowing, a garden overtaken by weeds. Some people said it was pilot error. Others whispered darker things: debt, betrayal, mob connections. A few even speculated that Richard had planned it all, a dramatic escape from something no one fully understood. But those were just stories, and stories were easy to tell when no one had answers. Still, for some, for Lacey, for a few quiet neighbors, and for Marissa Langley, a young deputy barely out of academy at the time, something had never sat right. You don't just vanish. Not with no trace. Not like that. But the years rolled on. People married, divorced, moved away. A generation grew up without knowing the names of the missing. And yet, there was always the house. The Dunmore home remained untouched. No for sale sign, no squatters, just shutters that never opened. A front porch that seemed to sigh under the weight of memory, and a single porch light that flickered sometimes at dusk, though no one knew why. For the town, it became a monument not to tragedy, but to uncertainty. A question mark at the end of a sentence everyone tried to forget. Until the day the Everglades gave up its secret. It was just past noon when Miguel Vargas, a hog hunter with a cigarette burned down to the filter and boots soaked in swamp water, caught his foot on something solid deep in the forbidden part of the Everglades. The area was thick with vines, roots, and the kind of silence that didn't feel natural. He cursed, reached down, and brushed away the wet muck. That's when he saw it. Metal, curved and rusted, with numbers barely visible beneath a lattice of moss and grime. His breath caught. He scraped away more with trembling hands. The sun overhead filtered through swamp trees, turning everything green and gold. Then, as if the Everglades were finally ready to speak, the tail section of a small plane emerged. The numbers confirmed what had only lived in rumor and fading newspaper headlines: N-1017D, the Dunmore plane, missing since 1978. Within hours, Sheriff Marissa Langley stood ankle-deep in water, eyes fixed on the twisted wreckage. The sun burned hot against her back, but her skin had gone cold. Unlike most of the town, she hadn't forgotten the Dunmores. She'd been 22 when they vanished. Green, idealistic, barely through training. The case had haunted her ever since. She could still remember standing at the edge of the original search grid, sweating in her new uniform, watching more experienced officers give up. But now, 9 years later, the swamp had given something back. She wasn't going to waste it. The fuselage was buried deep, like the earth had tried to swallow it whole. Deputies worked carefully to cut through vines and branches as insects buzzed around them in angry clouds. The waterlogged doors creaked open, revealing the interior, still, decayed, and disturbingly intact. The seats were torn, the floor thick with mud, but the cockpit held no sign of a crash. No broken glass, no blood, no bodies. Just two items sitting eerily untouched on the backseat bench: a green canvas duffel and a red plastic picnic cooler. Sheriff Langley crouched next to them, her boots making soft sucking sounds as they shifted in the mud. She reached out with gloved hands, unzipped the duffel, and paused. Inside were a teenage girl's change of clothes, a half-empty bottle of sunscreen, and a single piece of paper, folded neatly but warped from moisture. When she opened it, her breath stopped. It was a page torn from a diary. July 17th, 1978. He's not who he says he is. If something happens to us. The sentence ended there, ripped off, unfinished, like the rest of their story. Langley's fingers clenched slightly around the page. Her mind raced. Who was he? Wade Collins? Richard Dunmore? Someone else? The handwriting was young, slanted, anxious. It had to be Melanie's. She called for a forensics tent immediately and ordered every inch of the site photographed before nightfall. Word spread like fire through Cypress Bend. People gathered outside their homes, whispered on porches, called relatives they hadn't spoken to in years. News vans rolled into town by the dozen, satellite dishes rising like skeletal arms above the courthouse square. It was the biggest thing to hit Cypress Bend since the disappearance. And it wasn't over. Not even close. By evening, the full forensics team arrived, and with them more questions. Inside the cooler, tucked between melted plastic ice packs and a ruined sandwich bag, was another folded piece of paper, torn from the same diary. This one was dated 2 days before the flight. Dad seemed nervous this morning. Mom kept looking at Mr. Collins like she wanted to say something but couldn't. Something's off. The tension inside the evidence tent thickened with every item cataloged. Deputy Keith Mays returned from a sweep of the perimeter, carrying something in a plastic bag. "You're going to want to see this," he said quietly. 50 yards from the wreckage, wedged beneath a tangle of cypress roots, he had found a Polaroid photograph. The Dunmore family, standing beside the Cessna moments before takeoff. Richard had a forced smile and eyes fixed somewhere below the camera. Elaine's expression was pinched, her hand resting on Melanie's shoulder. Wade Collins stood behind them, arm casually draped across Melanie's back, his smile almost convincing. Except his eyes were hard, distant, unreadable. In the fading light of day, Langley stared at the photo, heart thudding in her chest. It wasn't just what the picture showed. It was what it didn't. The energy was wrong. Something about the pose felt posed, like it was for someone else's benefit, like they were already pretending they were okay. Back at the station, Langley laid the 2 diary pages and the photograph on the conference table. Around her, a team of deputies and analysts watched in silence. "This wasn't weather," she said finally. "This wasn't mechanical failure. They didn't even try to radio for help. Something happened before they ever left the ground." Eyes around the room darkened as realization settled. The wreck wasn't the end of the mystery. It was the beginning. She sent deputies to re-interview anyone still alive who'd known the Dunmores, Wade Collins, or had been involved in the original investigation. Some neighbors still remembered Elaine crying in her car the week before they vanished. Others mentioned seeing Wade visiting the Dunmore house late at night. More than one person remembered Richard burning papers in his backyard. And slowly, quietly, the whispers returned. But this time, they weren't about a family who had simply disappeared. They were about a town that had looked to the other way. The final clue of the day came just before midnight. Tucked inside the cooler's lid was a napkin, stained and nearly dissolved. On it was a phone number written in blue ink and a single sentence in a rushed, frantic hand. "If we don't come back, call this man. He'll know what to do." Langley ordered a trace on the number immediately. It led to a long, disconnected payphone in Miami, one that, according to Rafael Moreno's database, had appeared in the investigation of a Miami-based insurance fraud ring from the late 70s. The ring had disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, just like the Dunmores. Langley didn't sleep that night. She stared at the evidence until the sun rose. The torn diary pages, the Polaroid, the napkin, each one whispered the same message, louder and clearer. They were trying to get out. They were trying to leave something behind, something we were never supposed to find. Sheriff Marissa Langley stood at the edge of the swamp, the morning sun burning pale behind the mist. Her hands were cold despite the heat, fists buried deep in her jacket pockets. The damp air clung to her skin like sweat. All around her, the forest was waking. Cicadas buzzing, frogs croaking, the slow breath of water lapping at tree roots. But Marissa heard none of it. She only saw the photograph. The Dunmore family, smiling, or at least trying to. The image haunted her in a way she couldn't quite articulate. Richard's tight, distracted smile, Elaine's furrowed brow, her hand clenched too firmly around Melanie's arm, and Wade Collins, calm, poised, a half-smile stretched thin beneath unreadable eyes. Melanie's expression stood out the most. Not scared, not confused, just watchful, as if she knew something was wrong but wasn't allowed to say it out loud. Back at the station, Langley spread everything out on the war room table. Evidence tented under glass, pinned under weight. The diary fragments were enlarged and photographed. The napkin and its faded number were carefully dried and stored. And in the center of it all, the Polaroid sat like a silent witness. She called in Rafael Moreno from Miami. He arrived with 2 folders, one thin, one thick, and a face that had seen too many bodies and not enough justice. "That payphone number," Rafael said, flipping open the thinner folder, "shows up in 6 cold case files tied to small airfield pilots, all suspicious disappearances, all victims insured." He slid over a page. "And Victor Espriza? He's the name in the margins of every one of them. Never charged, but always there." Langley raised her eyes. Was Wade Collins one of them? Alias match: Peter Navarro, registered pilot for a defunct charter company, based outside Coral Gables. Guess who was on the board? He tapped Esparza's name. Langley felt her stomach knot. So we're looking at a pattern. Raphael nodded grimly. Or a business model. While investigators re-scanned the Dunmore house, Marissa requested a deep audit of Richard's financials. What they found chilled her. 3 weeks before the flight, Richard had taken out a life insurance policy with Elaine as beneficiary. The amount, $750,000. A week later, another policy, this one listing Wade Collins as secondary beneficiary in the event of family loss. It didn't make sense. Why would a pilot be listed as a beneficiary? She tried to reconcile it with what she remembered of the man. Wade had been professional, distant, respected among the older pilots. No criminal record, no complaints. But something in Melanie's words echoed louder now. He's not who he says he is. 1 day later, Langley's forensic team returned from the wreckage with a new discovery, a watch, found wedged beneath the pilot seat. The strap was cracked, the face shattered, but the engraving on the back was clear. To Richard, love always, Elaine. Dried blood caked the clasp. Marissa stared at it, heart racing. If Richard had died in the cockpit, why wasn't his body there? Why were there no remains? And if he hadn't, then who had been flying that plane? Deputy Keith Mays stepped into her office that evening, holding something in a sealed evidence bag. This just came back from the lab. Inside was the Polaroid. Only this time, it wasn't just about what was in the photo. It was about what was on it. A partial fingerprint, Keith said. Not Melanie's, not Richard's, not Wade's, not in any state family record. But he hesitated. But what? Langley asked. But it matches one in the unsolved Miami insurance ring case. A man named Victor Esparza, Cuban-American, 42 in 1978, known alias V.E. One reported distinguishing habit, always wore blue windbreakers. Langley's mind spun. Victor had touched that photograph. He had been near that plane, perhaps even at the airfield the morning it left. But why? If he wasn't the pilot, what was he doing near the family? And what did Melanie mean when she wrote, "If something happens to us"? She sat down heavily, eyes flicking back to the page dated 2 days before the disappearance. Dad seemed nervous this morning. Mom kept looking at Mr. Collins like she wanted to say something but couldn't. The family knew something. Maybe not the full shape of the danger, but enough to be afraid. Enough to leave behind breadcrumbs. Raphael called the next morning with a new lead. There's someone else, a woman. Claimed she saw Esparza arguing with a man who fits Richard's description behind the Dunmore hardware store just days before the flight. Langley tracked down the witness. Mrs. Judith Donovan, a longtime neighbor who lived across the street from the Dunmores. She welcomed Marissa into her living room, her voice soft but steady. I saw Richard in the backyard, burning papers. That was the week before they left. And Wade, he came by late, more than once. Judith paused. And Elaine, her voice broke. She gave me this envelope. Said, if something happens, give it to the police. But I never did. I was scared. Marissa took the envelope with reverence, her fingers trembling as she opened it. Inside, one note, in Elaine's handwriting. We are not safe. Watch the man in the blue jacket. Marissa closed her eyes. Everything was shifting. The flight wasn't just a sightseeing trip. It was an escape. Back at the station, the pieces formed a terrible shape. Victor Esparza had ties to the Dunmores. Wade Collins wasn't just a pilot. He was involved. Richard might have owed money, maybe from bad business or something darker. Elaine had known. Melanie had sensed it. The plane had been their way out, or their last chance. But what happened in the sky? And why? If it had gone down, had there been no bodies? That night, Marissa stood alone in the evidence room, staring at the board of photographs, documents, and scribbled notes. Every thread led to a single question. Where are the Dunmores? She didn't know yet, but she knew this. Whatever they had tried to escape had followed them into the sky. Rain hammered the tin roof of the sheriff's office like impatient fists. Outside, Cypress Bend disappeared behind a gray curtain of storm. Inside, Sheriff Marissa Langley stared at the evidence board, her breath fogging the glass over a pinned photograph. Each string connecting photos, names, and fragments of diary entries felt like a vein, alive, pulsing, leading somewhere dark and buried. Victor Esparza, Wade Collins, Richard Dunmore, Elaine, Melanie, Noah. Some names were known, some whispered. One still missing, the man in the blue jacket. Marissa clenched her jaw, the note from Elaine repeating in her mind. We are not safe. Watch the man in the blue jacket. That night, Roy Collins, Wade's estranged brother, was found trespassing near the old Dorsey sugar mill on the southern edge of town. The place had long been abandoned, swallowed by vines and rot. But Roy wasn't there to sightsee. Deputies caught him trying to bury a backpack filled with old flight logs, soggy receipts, and something heavier, a small handgun, rusted through, the serial number filed off. In the interview room, Roy looked like a man dragged backward through time. His beard was overgrown, eyes sunken, hands trembling. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He barely looked up. But when Marissa placed a photo of Wade on the table, his shoulders sank, like something inside him had finally cracked. They were supposed to fly, disappear, and never be found, he muttered. Wade promised it would be clean. A crash that looked real enough. Richard was scared. Elaine, she wanted out. Marissa leaned forward, voice calm. Out of what? Roy swallowed hard. They owed Victor. Wade got mixed up in it. Insurance scams, small charters disappearing with the money. Richard couldn't keep up. Victor threatened the kids, said he'd make an example. In the day of the flight? She asked. Roy looked at her, eyes finally meeting hers. Victor was there, at the airfield. He came in late, talked to Wade behind the hangar. I was in the truck. They were yelling. Something changed. Wade loaded extra fuel. No one said a word to Richard. I think Elaine knew. I think she knew they weren't going to make it to Everglades City. Marissa exhaled, the room suddenly tighter. Where did they go? Roy shook his head. I followed them. They circled back, landed near the Dorsey Mill. Wade said they needed to wait, said it wasn't safe to go south anymore. Elaine begged him to let the kids go. Victor laughed. He covered his face. A week later, Victor vanished. Wade came back alone. He told me not to ask. Told me if I ever talked, I'd disappear too. Marissa leaned in. Did Wade kill Victor? Roy looked like he was drowning. No, I did. The confession hit the room like a blow, but he didn't stop. Victor tried to take Melanie, said she'd fetch more than insurance. Wade hesitated. Richard fought back. There was blood, screaming. Elaine shoved the kids into the supply shed and locked the door from outside. I found Victor bleeding in the grass. I finished it. I buried him near the tree line. I thought it was over. But it wasn't, Marissa said. No, Roy whispered. because someone else paid Wade to stay quiet. Someone local. I saw him once. Came in uniform. A handshake behind the mill. I didn't know who he was until I saw his picture in the paper years later. He reached into his pocket and slid across a crumpled photo. It was a grainy snapshot, but unmistakable. Wade Collins shaking hands with Sheriff Curtis Mace, Marissa's predecessor. The man who had led the original investigation. The man who had declared the Dunmore case exhausted after just 2 weeks. Marissa sat back in her chair, the storm outside crashing like surf. Every cell in her body burned. Curtis Mace. He wasn't just negligent, he was complicit. That night, as thunder rolled over the Everglades, Marissa and her deputies converged on a hunting cabin west of town. It belonged to Mace. No one had seen him in days. The windows were dark, but the truck parked out front was warm to the touch. Marissa approached the front door alone, pistol holstered but ready. She knocked once. "Curtis," she called, her voice clear through the rain. "It's time." The door creaked open. Curtis Mace stood in the doorway, older now, gray swallowing the last of his once black hair. His badge was gone, but his eyes hadn't changed. Cold, steady, like a man who'd convinced himself that what he'd done had a purpose. "You shouldn't be here, Marissa," he said. "Neither should you," she replied. Inside, the house smelled of old wood, whiskey, and something older, regret maybe. Curtis sat without invitation, gesturing toward a folder on the table. "You want answers?" he said. "Take them." She didn't move. "Why?" she asked. "Why cover it up?" Curtis stared at her, then poured a drink with hands that didn't shake. "Because Wade came to me. Said a family was in trouble. Said it would get worse if I didn't help. I thought I was buying time. Thought if we could fake a crash, they could disappear, start over. But it got complicated. Money changed hands. Victor got violent. Wade panicked. And you let them vanish," Marissa said, voice tight. Curtis didn't deny it. He raised his glass instead. "I buried a lie to protect a town." "No," Marissa said. "You buried a family." Curtis looked away. Before she could reach for the folder, a gunshot split the silence. One of her deputies yelling from outside. Marissa drew her weapon, rushed toward the rear of the cabin. A trap door in the floor had been thrown open. Curtis was gone. The folder, too. She followed through the swampy brush behind the cabin, adrenaline roaring. She caught him near the creek, stumbling over roots, the metal folder clutched tight. "Stop!" she shouted. Curtis turned. And for a second, he looked tired, not like a man running, but like one trying to get somewhere he'd never reach. "I didn't kill them," he called through the rain. "But I let it happen. That's worse." He dropped to his knees, surrendered the box. Inside, photographs, letters, and a cassette labeled in Wade's handwriting. Dunmore evidence. For sheriff's eyes only. Back at the station, long past midnight, Marissa sat alone. The storm had passed, but its echo clung to the air. She pressed play. Wade's voice, shaky and low, filled the room. "If you're hearing this, I'm probably dead. Victor's out of control. Richard can't pay. Elaine's scared. The kids, Melanie knows. If this gets out, we're all dead. You know what to do." Marissa paused the tape. Everything was unraveling. But the worst part wasn't what had happened. It was that someone, somewhere, might still be keeping it buried. And the truth wasn't done clawing its way out. Marissa sat in her office at dawn, the light gray and lifeless outside the windows. The evidence box from the hunting cabin lay open in front of her, its contents spread like puzzle pieces across the desk. Photographs, receipts, Wade's taped confession, and Elaine's final note. Folded and refolded so many times, the creases had worn thin. But what Marissa couldn't stop staring at, what wouldn't stop pulsing in the quiet, was that single sentence scrawled by Elaine. If my children survive, tell them we didn't stay silent. Deputy Keith Mays entered with a quiet knock. "We have something," he said, holding a printed scan. Came from the old Department of Children's Services files in Georgia. There were 2 children, Jane and John Doe, admitted to a Savannah shelter in late 1978. The girl was 14, the boy about 10. Found wandering near a train station, no ID, malnourished. One wore a bracelet engraved Noah. The girl had a silver locket with a piano etched on it. Marissa's heart surged. She snatched the photo from his hand. 2 children, huddled side by side on a cot, dirty, hollow-eyed, but unmistakably, impossibly, them, Melanie and Noah Dunmore. She didn't speak for a long moment, her voice caught somewhere between disbelief and hope. Then she said, "Find them, wherever they are now, find them." The search took less than a day. The girl, now Melissa Thomas, was a librarian living outside Savannah, soft-spoken, private, divorced. No children. Her younger brother, Nate, a park ranger, had changed his name at 18 and never looked back. Melissa had always carried something locked deep behind her eyes, a kind of learned silence. Even her closest friends described her as kind, but distant, like someone waiting for a knock that never came. That knock came 3 days later. Marissa stood at Melissa's doorstep, holding nothing but a photograph and a name Melissa hadn't heard spoken in decades. "Melanie," Marissa said gently. "My name is Marissa Langley. I'm sheriff of Cypress Bend, and I think we found where you came from." The silence stretched between them like a ravine. Then Melissa staggered back a step, her fingers flying to the locket at her throat. It had never left her neck. Inside was a photo. A girl and a boy. A clarinet and a baseball glove. That night, Melissa and Nate drove in silence down I-95, heading back to the place they had never expected to see again. Cypress Bend. They arrived on a quiet Sunday morning. The town hadn't changed much. The courthouse still stood at the center like a spine. The trees bent the same way in the summer wind. But for the siblings, it wasn't familiarity. It was ghosts. Nate stepped out first, taller now, heavier, his cap low over his brow. He hadn't spoken since they crossed the county line. Melissa stood beside him, looking up at the courthouse as if afraid it might vanish if she blinked. Inside, Marissa waited. She welcomed them, not with questions, but with relics, items pulled from the swamp, preserved like sacred artifacts. She placed the Polaroids on the table, one by one. The last photo showed them standing by the plane, days before everything fell apart. Then she slid over 2 more. One, a photo of Victor Esparza shouting beside the Cessna, a roll of cash in hand. The other, Richard and Elaine bound together inside a dim cabin, faces drawn and eyes pleading. Melissa stared, her hands trembling. "I remember that cabin," she whispered. "It smelled like gasoline. They made us sleep on the floor. Mom cried every night. Dad, he just..." Stop talking. Nate clenched his jaw. He kept saying it was his fault. They told the story in pieces. After the plane turned from its path, Wade landed in a clearing near the Dorsey sugar mill. He claimed they needed to wait for someone. Victor arrived that night, demanding more money. Richard had none. Wade grew nervous. Elaine tried to hide the children in a storage shed, but Victor found them. He threatened to take Melanie, said she was worth something. That's when everything fell apart. Melissa looked straight into Marissa's eyes as she spoke. My mother fought him. My father did too. There was a gun, screaming, then nothing. Wade dragged us out, said if we ran, we'd die. We didn't listen, we ran anyway. Nate added, we hid in the woods for 3 nights. We followed the canal until we found a road. A trucker picked us up near the Georgia line. We didn't tell him our names. We never told anyone, ever. They were placed in foster care. New names, new lives, no questions. Until now. Marissa sat still for a long time before she finally asked, why didn't you try to come back? Tell someone. Melissa's voice cracked. Because we were kids. Because they said they'd find us. Because the people who were supposed to protect us were the ones who let it happen. Outside, the storm clouds gathered again. But this time, no one looked away. Later that afternoon, the town held a private vigil at the river. Lanterns were floated into the current. One for each year the siblings had been gone. One for Richard. One for Elaine. One for silence. Melissa and Nate stood shoulder to shoulder, eyes locked on the glow reflecting over dark water. For a moment, it felt like time broke open, letting the past and present sit beside each other. Marissa walked up quietly, carrying a box wrapped in linen. I think these belong to you, she said. Inside was a folded baseball jersey with Noah stitched on the back, a clarinet mouthpiece, a faded birthday card from Elaine, and a cassette tape labeled in careful cursive, Melanie, first recital. Melissa gasped. She turned away, pressing the locket to her lips as if it could hold her together. Nate looked at the box, then at Marissa. You found everything. Marissa nodded slowly. Not everything. Not yet. But we know where to look. Nate reached into the box and pulled out the jersey. She always told us not to look back, he said. But I think maybe she left the trail behind for a reason. Melissa's voice was barely above a whisper. So we could finish what she started. And just like that, the silence that had defined them for so long began to crack. Not shattered by rage or revenge, but by truth, rising steady from the dark. The morning air was thick with memory. Cypress Bend had not felt this awake in years. Word had spread like wildfire, not just across town, but across the state. The Dunmore children were alive, and they were home. But for Sheriff Marissa Langley, the return of Melissa and Nate was only the beginning of a different kind of reckoning. Curtis Mace sat in a windowless holding room, silent, his weathered hands folded tightly in front of him. He had confessed enough to lock himself away for years. Obstruction, conspiracy, aiding in the cover-up of a staged disappearance. But what haunted Marissa, more than the crimes, were the years he stole. From a family, from a town, from the truth itself. She had spent most of the night reviewing every page of Elaine's letters, every receipt Richard had signed, every coded note Melanie had tucked into those diary pages. And one thing became achingly clear. The plan to vanish had never been theirs. It had been forced upon them, one whispered threat at a time, until there was no exit except surrender or silence. And somehow, even after death, Elaine had refused to surrender completely. At dawn, Marissa accompanied Melissa and Nate to the old Dunmore house. The shutters creaked when Melissa opened them. Dust danced in the beams of early morning sun as the door swung open. The house was frozen in time. Photos still hung on the wall. Birthdays, school plays, Little League trophies. The living room radio, yellowed with age, sat on a side table. Nate pressed the power button and the old machine crackled, still alive after all these years, tuning to a familiar country station. A melody from the past floated into the quiet house like a ghost, finally coming home. Melissa walked slowly to her childhood bedroom, trailing her fingers along the faded wallpaper. Her clarinet case still sat beneath the bed, unopened since that day in 1978. She lifted it into her lap, her fingers trembling, and wept, not for what was lost, but for what survived. Meanwhile, across town, the courthouse buzzed. Reporters gathered at the steps. A special session had been convened. Curtis Mace would stand trial. Roy Collins, too, his silence having cost too much to ignore. The district attorney prepared a case that wasn't just about fraud or failure. It was about betrayal at the deepest level. Melissa testified first. Her voice was steady as she told the court about the plane's detour, the landing near the sugar mill, the cabin that smelled of oil and panic. She spoke of Elaine's attempts to protect them, of Richard's slow unraveling under Victor Esparza's threats. She described the night they ran, barefoot and bleeding, through the swamp, carrying nothing but fear and the will to live. Then Nate spoke, less emotional, more clipped, but no less powerful. We waited for someone to come. No one did. Not the police, not the neighbors, not even the people who knew something was wrong. He glanced toward the defense table, and yet we survived anyway. Outside the courtroom, a crowd gathered. Some wept, some bowed their heads, others stood with hands folded, unsure of what to say to the children they once thought dead. Marissa took the podium afterward, not to speak about the case, but about what came next. This was never just about a crime, she said. It was about a silence that lasted too long, about the people we failed and the ones who refused to disappear. Later that night, the town gathered at the riverside for a vigil. Candles floated on the water, one for each Dunmore: Richard, Elaine, Melanie, Noah. The siblings stood side by side at the edge of the dock, the crowd silent behind them. Melissa clutched the locket around her neck. Nate held his old baseball cap in his hands, fingers gripping it like a lifeline. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. That moment wasn't for words. It was for presence, for finally being seen. When the last lantern disappeared downriver, Marissa approached quietly. "There's something else," she said, holding out a sealed box. "We found it in the final file folder Mace tried to destroy. Elaine's last letter." Melissa opened the envelope with trembling hands. The ink was faded, but the handwriting was unmistakable. "If you find this, it means someone finally listened. We tried. God, we tried. If you're reading this, my babies, live. Don't carry our fear. Don't forget who you are. Your father loved you. I loved you more than life. And the world is still worth trusting, even if it takes time." Melissa read it aloud, her voice breaking halfway through. Nate wrapped an arm around her shoulder, and the two of them stood there, no longer just survivors, but children reclaimed from the shadows. In the weeks that followed, the town of Cypress Bend began to heal. Melissa volunteered at the local library, starting a children's reading program in Elaine's memory. Nate worked with local boys, teaching them survival skills and leading hikes into the same woods he once feared he'd die in. The Dunmore house came back to life. Neighbors offered casseroles again, this time out of care, not pity. The garden was restored, the windows thrown open. Marissa retired that fall. Her final act as sheriff was to create a cold case review unit staffed by volunteers and local law enforcement to ensure that no other family in Cypress Bend would ever be lost in silence again. Before she left office, she stood with Melissa and Nate at the newly unveiled town memorial, a bronze plaque by the riverbank that read, "In memory of those who endured, and in honor of those who refused to disappear." As twilight set in that evening, Melissa and Nate sat on the porch steps of their family home, the sky soft and golden. "I used to dream of this," Nate said quietly. "Not the courtroom, not the cameras, just this, you and me, home." Melissa nodded, the locket warm in her palm. "We were never really gone," she said, "just waiting to be found." They sat in silence, listening to the breeze rustle the trees, the sound of a new chapter finally beginning. And somewhere in the dark, the silence that had defined them for so long faded away, not forgotten, but forgiven.